They said America was free. But in the quiet parlors of Boston, in the narrow pews of its churches, and beneath the orderly rhythm of its factories, that freedom was already beginning to fade, dulled by imitation, smothered by comfort. It was the 1830s, and the young nation, born from rebellion, was learning how easily rebellion turns into obedience. In those years, silence had a sound. It was the murmur of conformity, polite conversation over tea, sermons that promised heaven yet feared new thought, and the unspoken rule that one must never disturb the peace. In such a world, independence of mind, the kind that burns quietly like a candle in wind, was considered almost indecent. And yet, somewhere in that silence, one man began to listen. Ralph Waldo Emerson was not born to be a revolutionary. He wore no armor, carried no sword. He was a minister's son from Boston, soft-spoken, restrained, haunted by a gentleness that society mistook for obedience. But within him lived an unease, a hunger for something purer, freer, more alive than the clockwork religion and stale intellect around him. In his youth, he walked the same paths as every dutiful New England son. He studied theology at Harvard. He wrote sermons that soothed the congregation. He married a delicate young woman, as expected. He did everything right. But sometimes at dawn, he would walk alone along the Charles River, the mist thick as breath on glass, and feel the strange pull of something unnamed, as though nature itself was whispering that the soul was meant to be more than obedient. He did not yet have the words for it, only a discomfort, the way one feels trapped inside a suit that no longer fits, even though it was tailored perfectly. Inside the marble walls of Boston's churches, Emerson felt his spirit shrinking. He preached about divine order, but dreamt of wild forests. He spoke of duty, but longed for the sky. His sermons, though eloquent, began to tremble with questions he could no longer hide. Then death came, quietly, mercilessly, to remind him that obedience never saves us. His young wife, Ellen, whom he adored with the kind of love that made the air itself seem sacred, died of tuberculosis after less than 2 years of marriage. Emerson sat by her grave every evening, as the cemetery filled with the scent of wet leaves, and wondered how a universe that claimed to be ruled by love could be so indifferent. He opened her coffin one night, weeks after the burial, just to see if her body was truly gone. He wrote in his journal, "I visited Ellen's tomb. Why did I wish to see her again? Has she any new truth to tell me?" It was the act of a man not in madness, but in awakening, one who had glimpsed how fragile every system of belief becomes when it collides with grief. That night marked the death of his faith in inherited truth. He resigned from his pulpit soon after, declaring he could no longer serve a church that worshiped tradition more than truth. It was a quiet rebellion, no fire, no spectacle, only a letter of resignation and a deep silence that followed. But that silence was not emptiness. It was the birth of a voice. Boston called it arrogance. Harvard called it heresy. But Emerson had stepped into the wilderness, both literal and spiritual. He began walking for hours through the woods near Concord, where pine trees replaced steeples and the rustle of leaves became scripture. He felt, for the first time, that the divine was not locked in a church, but alive in every trembling branch, in every gust of wind, in the living pulse of nature. This was not religion as he had known it. It was a revelation without a priest, a conversation without an audience. He wrote, "The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." It was blasphemy to many, but to Emerson it was liberation. The moment the walls of the soul cracked open and let the infinite pour in. He began writing essays instead of sermons, replacing sacred texts with the sacredness of experience itself. And yet, for all his eloquence, Emerson was not simply rejecting tradition. He was attempting to free it. He believed that the divine voice still spoke, but that humanity had grown deaf from repetition. Religion had become a cage built for memory. Society had mistaken imitation for virtue. He saw America itself falling into that same trap. A land once founded on rebellion, now smothered by imitation of Europe. Its artists wrote like the British. Its thinkers quoted the Germans. Its politicians borrowed the language of old monarchies. Freedom had become an echo rather than a creation. So Emerson set himself a different task, not to reform institutions, but to awaken individuals. He would teach that the truest revolution begins not in the streets, but in the self. The soul, he believed, was the last frontier left unexplored. And in that frontier lay the future of civilization. But such ideas were dangerous in a country still young enough to be insecure. The more Emerson spoke, the more he became a stranger in his own society. The ministers who once invited him to dinner now crossed the street to avoid him. His friends smiled politely, but whispered that he had lost his faith. And yet, he remained calm, almost serene, as though he knew that solitude was the price of authenticity. One winter evening, he wrote in his study as snow fell softly outside his Concord home. The fireplace crackled, his ink froze between sentences, and he paused to stare at the dim lantern light flickering against the glass. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when a man finally understands that being misunderstood is not a tragedy, but a kind of freedom. Whoso would be a man, he would later write, must be a nonconformist. And with that, Emerson, the quiet minister who once feared doubt, became something else entirely. The voice of America's inner rebellion. A poet of independence, not of nations, but of souls. The silence that followed Emerson's resignation was not peaceful. It was vast, like standing in an empty cathedral after the choir has gone home. Every word he had once preached now echoed back at him, hollow and weightless. For the first time in his life, he had no audience, no institution, no creed to shelter behind. Only the raw sound of his own thoughts, untested and unguarded. He began to wander, not just through forests and meadows, but through the ruins of his own certainty. Grief had hollowed him out, but that emptiness became a kind of vessel. In solitude, he discovered what no pulpit had ever taught him, that sometimes losing everything familiar is the only way the soul can learn to speak. He wrote constantly. In journals filled with delicate handwriting, his words grew wild, restless, almost fevered. "Let us be silent," he wrote, "that we may hear the whisper of God." But this God was not the one of stained glass or scripture. It was the living pulse within all things, the divine that breathed through trees, rivers, stars, and through the fragile consciousness of man himself. He began to call this force the Oversoul. It was neither the Christian heaven nor the philosopher's abstraction, but something more intimate, a unity that lived within the individual and beyond him at once. Each soul, he believed, was a fragment of the infinite, a spark of the same eternal fire. It was an audacious thought, that holiness was not found in obedience, but in awareness. And yet, to Emerson, it felt less like invention than discovery. Every time he walked into nature, he felt that something, or someone, walked with him. Not a God above, but a presence within. The whisper that said, "You are enough, if only you are true." He carried that whisper across the Atlantic in 1833. Seeking renewal, Emerson sailed to Europe. A voyage that was part pilgrimage, part escape. He visited Paris, where the city pulsed with the mechanical rhythm of modern life. He saw the great botanical gardens, where plants from every corner of the world were arranged by taxonomy. Nature turned into knowledge. And there, amid glass domes and pinned butterflies, he began to see the limits of human understanding. "We classify the rose," he wrote, "and forget its fragrance." In England, he met the poets who had set the world on fire with words: Wordsworth, Coleridge, and especially Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle, with his wild Scottish eyes and prophetic voice, spoke of the need for moral heroes in an age of doubt. They walked together through mist-covered fields, debating God, industry, and the future of man. Carlyle urged action. Emerson urged reflection. And somewhere between their two voices, a new philosophy began to form, one that sought not to conquer nature, but to become conscious within it. When Emerson returned to America, he was no longer a minister. He was a seeker. He settled in Concord, Massachusetts, a small town surrounded by pine woods and rivers that seemed older than memory. His home became a sanctuary for ideas too fragile for the cities, too wild for the pulpits. And soon, like moths to a quiet flame, others began to find their way there. Henry David Thoreau, the young schoolteacher who would one day build a cabin at Walden Pond, walked the same trails as Emerson, listening to his words like one listens to rain on a still lake. Margaret Fuller, fiery and brilliant, came to discuss the rights of women and the power of the individual mind. Bronson Alcott, idealist and dreamer, saw in Emerson's house the beginning of a new Eden. They called themselves the Transcendentalists, though the name came later. In truth, they were less a group than a gathering of restless souls, united by a single conviction: that truth is not inherited, but experienced. For Emerson, this was not mere philosophy. It was a rebirth. He began giving public lectures, not sermons, not lessons, but meditations in motion. He spoke of nature, of intuition, of the divine spark that lives inside every human being. He stood before audiences in Boston and Harvard, his voice soft yet magnetic, as though each word were drawn not from intellect, but from something older and more elemental. And the people listened, though many did not understand. They came expecting theology. They left with something closer to poetry. He spoke without notes, as though language itself was discovering him in the moment. The newspapers called his ideas vaporous, dangerous, even un-American. But for every critic, there was a listener whose life quietly changed that night, someone who walked home beneath the stars and felt for the first time that they too might think freely. In one of his early lectures, Emerson said, "The faith that stands on authority is not faith. The reliance on the authority of others is the weakness of self." Those words struck at the very root of American culture, a culture that prized conformity disguised as respectability. To be self-reliant, he argued, was not arrogance, it was responsibility. Because if you did not trust your own mind, someone else surely would, and they would use it to think for you. Yet, the courage to think for oneself is the loneliest kind of freedom. Emerson felt it keenly. He was often mocked, misquoted, misjudged. At Harvard, a group of professors dismissed his lectures as moonlight mysticism. One minister wrote that Emerson's ideas would dissolve the very fabric of moral order. But Emerson did not fight back. He simply smiled that quiet, knowing smile. The same one that had carried him through the death of his wife, through exile from his church. He knew that every great truth begins as blasphemy. In his solitude, he found strength in the simplicity of daily life. He planted gardens, chopped wood, and read Plato by lamplight. He wrote essays with titles like Nature, Self-Reliance, and The American Scholar, texts that would become sacred to generations of thinkers after him. But to Emerson, they were simply letters to the future, messages in bottles cast into the sea of time, addressed to whoever still believed that the mind was its own continent. Nature remained his greatest companion. When words failed, he walked. When the world mocked him, he listened to the river. And when doubt returned, as it always did, he would look to the sky and whisper to himself, "Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles." From grief, a new voice had risen, gentle, luminous, unyielding. Not the voice of rebellion shouting against the world, but of revelation whispering through it. The young minister who once feared to speak now spoke for a generation. His awakening had become a mirror in which others could glimpse their own. The philosopher-poet of Concord had found what he did not know he was looking for: a faith without fear, a God without walls, a freedom that began and ended within. And as the years passed, that quiet voice would grow into something larger than the man himself, a movement that would awaken America's soul. Winter in New England carries a particular kind of silence, the kind that seems to listen back. The snow lies thick over Concord, the air brittle with stillness, and from a small study on the second floor of a modest wooden house, a candle burns past midnight. Inside, Ralph Waldo Emerson sits alone at his desk, ink-stained fingers resting on an unfinished page. Outside, the world sleeps. Inside, an idea begins to breathe. That night, he writes the words that will forever alter the spirit of his nation. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. He doesn't yet know that these lines will echo across centuries, taught in classrooms, recited by politicians, and misunderstood by millions. He only knows that he has finally found the sound of his own voice, and it sounds like freedom. In Self-Reliance, Emerson does not preach rebellion. He preaches awakening. To rely on oneself is not to live without others, but to live without imitation. Imitation is suicide, Rodriguez. He writes, and he means it literally. For every borrowed thought, every unexamined belief, kills a small piece of the soul. To live truly, one must dare to be misunderstood. That idea was dangerous in an America still obsessed with order. The young republic had survived revolution only to fall in love with routine. Factories were rising, cities were swelling, the frontier was shrinking, and conformity, that silent empire of the mind, was spreading faster than the nation's borders. Emerson stood apart, not as a prophet on a mountaintop, but as a man whispering in the wilderness. His words were not thunder, but wind. Yet the wind, as he knew, reshapes the world more patiently than storms. He began giving lectures across the Northeast. The rooms were often cold, the candles flickered, and the audience sat stiff in their winter coats. But when he spoke, something stirred. His voice carried the rhythm of Scripture, but the content of revolt. He told farmers, merchants, housewives, and students that divinity was not locked in heaven, but alive in their own reason, that the universe whispered through them if they only dared to listen. Nothing is at last sacred, he said, but the integrity of your own mind. In a time when Americans still bowed to Europe for culture and to the church for morality, this was heresy disguised as hope. And yet, it was not arrogance that moved him. Emerson did not seek to replace God, but to awaken the God within, the divine spark that every man and woman carries, but most forget to protect. He spoke of the individual not as a lonely island, but as a wave of the same vast ocean, unique yet inseparable from all others. This, he said, was the paradox of true freedom, that to be fully yourself is also to be fully united with all that lives. The critics called him dangerous. One Boston newspaper accused him of poisoning youth with mysticism. A clergyman declared that the devil speaks in his eloquence. Even his friend Carlyle, writing from across the Atlantic, worried that Emerson's new gospel of self might turn man into his own idol. But Emerson smiled, as he always did. "Is it not better," he wrote in reply, to worship the divinity that stirs within than the one that slumbers above? His philosophy began to take root in unlikely soil. Students at Harvard quoted him in secret notebooks. Farmers in Vermont wrote him letters about finding God in their plows and morning dew. Women denied the pulpit, read his essays aloud to one another, and found in his words a permission long withheld, the right to think without apology. To them, Emerson was more than a writer. He was a quiet contagion, spreading an invisible revolution through the soul of America. He often walked alone through the forest near Walden Pond, where his young protege, Henry David Thoreau, would soon build a cabin and write of his own rebellion against society's noise. There, among birch trees and the distant sound of frogs, Emerson saw his philosophy reflected in the landscape itself. Each tree stood distinct, individual, yet each drew life from the same unseen soil. Nature, he realized, was the perfect democracy. No hierarchy, no imitation, only expression. The soul, he thought, must live in the same way. Not to copy, not to conform, but to unfold. At twilight, he would return to his desk, the window fogged with his breath, and write lines that seemed to burn from within. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. It was not bravado, but compassion. He saw conformity as a disease of fear, the fear of being alone, the terror of disapproval. But solitude, Emerson believed, was not emptiness. It was the chamber where truth learns to speak. He wrote that every man carries within him a private law, a compass more precise than any doctrine. Ignore it, and you become a shadow. Follow it, and you become a creator. Do your work, he urged, and I shall know you. Do your work, and you shall reinforce yourself. In Concord, visitors came more and more. Poets, dreamers, philosophers, radicals. His house became an unintentional temple of independence. They would sit in his parlor, the fire glowing faintly, and discuss not politics but principles, not what to think, but how to think. When they left, they carried something invisible with them, permission to live awake. Emerson himself was not without doubt. There were nights when his own philosophy turned against him, when grief and age made him wonder whether self-reliance was simply another form of pride. But each time despair crept in, nature answered. He would step outside, breathe the cold New England air, and see in the vastness of the stars a reminder that the soul's independence was never isolation. It was participation in a grander design. America, he believed, was not a country. It was an idea. And that idea lived only as long as its people dared to think freely. A nation that traded independence for imitation would rot from the inside out. He did not want followers. He wanted awakeners. He wanted each listener to become a philosopher in their own right, to discover their iron string and let it vibrate in harmony with the universe. He imagined a new kind of citizen, one who lived not by law, but by conscience. That, he thought, would be America's true revolution, not political, but spiritual. In 1841, Self-Reliance was published. It sold modestly. The critics mocked it. But it spread quietly, like fire beneath snow. Farmers folded it in their coat pockets. Teachers read it to students by candlelight. The young Abraham Lincoln kept a copy of Emerson's essays in his satchel. And across the ocean, even the German philosopher Nietzsche, years later, would call Emerson my moral father. Emerson never claimed to lead. He only spoke, and in that speaking, gave others permission to begin. As his candle burned low, he closed his journal and stared out into the winter night. The fields lay buried in white, silent, infinite. He thought of his wife's grave, of the church he had left behind, of all the certainties he had broken, and smiled. Somewhere in that wilderness, his words were beginning to echo, softly, invisibly, in the hearts of those who had never met him. And though the world might forget his name, it would never forget his idea. That the truest act of faith is to trust the voice that speaks within. There are moments in history when an idea takes human form, when philosophy walks, breathes, and argues beside a fire. In the small New England town of Concord, that moment arrived quietly in the 1840s. The world called it coincidence. But to those who were there, it felt like destiny, a gathering of minds who had each heard, in their own solitude, the same whisper of awakening. It began, as so many revolutions do, in a living room. Emerson's house on Lexington Road was not grand. White clapboard walls, modest windows, a small study lined with books, and the scent of pine smoke. But on certain evenings, when the lamps glowed and the frost glittered on the windows, it became something sacred. There, poets, teachers, reformers, and wanderers came together, bound not by creed or dogma, but by restlessness. They were searching for a new faith, not of churches, but of consciousness. The newspapers later called them the Transcendental Club. To its members, that name sounded almost ironic. There were no robes, no hierarchy, no official purpose. Only long conversations that stretched into the night, and the shared conviction that truth was not handed down from authority, but risen up from the soul. They gathered around Emerson's fire, cups of black coffee steaming in their hands. The wind outside howled through the elms. Inside, ideas collided like sparks. And, in that collision, something luminous began to form. Henry David Thoreau was there, quiet, intense, his eyes the color of the forest after rain. He spoke little, preferring to listen, but when he did speak, it was like a stone dropped into still water. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, he murmured once, and everyone fell silent. Thoreau saw what others ignored. That modern life was becoming a prison built from comfort, and that the only escape was to return to simplicity, to live deliberately, to touch the raw earth again. Beside him sat Margaret Fuller, the only woman in the circle, and perhaps the fiercest mind among them. She was a force of nature in silk and ink, her intellect blazing, her sentences unfolding like music. To her, the liberation of the soul meant nothing if women remained bound by custom. She argued not for power, but for wholeness, that every human, male or female, must awaken to their full divinity. Male and female represent the two sides of the great radical dualism, she said, but in truth, they are one. The men listened, half in admiration, half in fear of how right she was. Bronson Alcott sat opposite, an idealist with the face of a prophet and the finances of a dreamer. He spoke of a perfect school where children learned through intuition, not punishment, where imagination, not obedience, was the highest virtue. Most dismissed him as impractical. Emerson only smiled. Perhaps, he said softly, the impractical is the beginning of the real. Others came and went. George Ripley, who had found Brook Farm, a utopian commune where labor and intellect would live side by side. Theodore Parker, a minister too radical even for the radicals, who thundered against slavery from his pulpit. Even Nathaniel Hawthorne appeared, reserved and brooding, his dark eyes betraying both fascination and unease. He admired their light, but feared its fire. Each voice in that room was distinct, and yet, together, they formed something that felt larger than any single soul. It was as if the American spirit itself, raw, idealistic, unfinished, had taken shape and begun to speak through them. Emerson, the quiet center of the storm, rarely dictated. He guided. When arguments grew fierce, he would only say, let us not seek to win, but to understand. He believed that truth did not live in victory, but in exchange, that every soul carried a fragment of the whole. And so they spoke of nature as scripture, of the self as revelation, of society as the shadow that the individual must step through. They debated whether progress was salvation or illusion, whether democracy ennobled the soul or numbed it. They quoted Plato, Goethe, and the Bhagavad Gita, but always returned to the question that haunted them all. If the divine lives in each of us, how then shall we live? From those conversations came essays, lectures, and dreams that would outlast them all. In 1840, they launched a small journal called The Dial. Margaret Fuller served as editor. Its pages carried words that few Americans understood, but none could forget. Visions of a new spiritual independence, the promise of harmony between man and nature, intellect and intuition, self and soul. Sales were poor, but the echo was immense. It was read by farmers, abolitionists, and a young Walt Whitman in Brooklyn, who would one day call Emerson master. The world outside Concord was less kind. To many, the Transcendentalists were either naive or dangerous, dreamers who talked of light while the nation built railroads and factories. The press mocked them as the club of moon-gazers, but history would prove that their moonlight illuminated far more than the lamps of their critics. Their gatherings were not only intellectual, but spiritual performances. Sometimes, after long debate, silence would fall, not out of exhaustion, but reverence. The fire would crackle, snow would fall, and someone, usually Emerson, would whisper a line of poetry into the quiet. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. In that silence, they were no longer philosophers or reformers. They were believers, not in doctrine, but in experience, in the simple, radiant fact of being alive. They were not trying to escape the world, they were trying to see it again. To recover what civilization forgets, that to think freely is to love deeply, and that freedom of the mind is the highest form of morality. When Thoreau later built his cabin by Walden Pond, Emerson visited often. They would walk along the frozen water, discussing eternity and the price of independence. Thoreau believed that to live in solitude was to live truthfully. Emerson believed that solitude was only meaningful when shared in spirit. And between those two visions, the solitary man and the communal thinker, American philosophy found its balance. By the mid-1840s, the Transcendental Circle had already begun to scatter. Brook Farm collapsed under debt and disillusion. Margaret Fuller sailed to Europe to cover the Italian Revolution. She would die in a shipwreck returning home. Thoreau withdrew deeper into his own experiment at Walden. Alcott drifted between idealism and poverty. And yet, the idea they had summoned refused to die. It had already left the room, carried on pages, in lectures, in the quiet hearts of readers who would never meet them. Emerson's house, once alive with debate, fell silent again. He would sometimes sit by the same window where they had gathered, watching the sunset spill gold over the meadows, and think of the conversations that had once filled the air. He did not mourn. He understood. Every idea, like every life, must first gather in one place, and then scatter to seed the world. He wrote in his journal, "The world's soul is a great traveler. It borrows us for a moment, then moves on." And somewhere in that reflection, in that quiet house surrounded by trees, Emerson realized that his greatest work was not his essays, nor his lectures, but the community of awakened minds he had inspired. The Golden Concord had ended, but the light it lit would not go out. It would pass through Whitman, through Thoreau, through generations of dreamers, reformers, and wanderers. all who believed that America's true revolution was not political, but spiritual. A rebellion not of nations, but of souls. It was a warm August morning in 1837, and Harvard Yard shimmered under a haze of sunlight. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and anticipation, the kind that always precedes something that cannot be undone. Students in dark coats filled the hall, professors sat in solemn rows, and the old portraits of Puritan divines stared down from the walls with silent disapproval. At the front stood a thin man with calm eyes and an unhurried voice. He did not look like a revolutionary. But when Ralph Waldo Emerson began to speak, he did not address a classroom. He addressed a nation. He called his speech The American Scholar. No one expected much. It was, after all, a ceremonial address. But what unfolded that day would later be called the Declaration of Independence of the American Mind. For in that hour, Emerson broke the spell of imitation that had haunted the young republic since its birth. He began quietly, almost conversationally. He spoke not of politics or theology, but of the soul's duty to think. Man is not a mere fragment, he said, but a whole. The mind of man is the world's mind, writ small. The audience leaned forward. They had expected reverence. He gave them revolution. He spoke of scholars who had become echo chambers, men who repeated the thoughts of Europe as though wisdom itself had crossed the Atlantic in a trunk. Books, he said, are for the scholar's idle times. There was an audible murmur at that. Books, sacred objects in that hall of learning, now called idols. But Emerson did not flinch. He spoke of a nation still looking over its shoulder, quoting Locke and Bacon while ignoring the voice within. He challenged them not to destroy tradition, but to transcend it, to stop worshiping the past and start listening to the present. In self-trust, he said, all the virtues are comprehended. The words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. He told them that true scholarship was not memorization, but creation. That the scholar's duty was not to preserve knowledge, but to renew it. Each generation, he said, must write its own scripture. And the American mind, if it were ever to be free, must stop bowing to its ancestors and dare to think as if the world had just begun. To the young men in the audience, it was intoxicating. They had grown up in a culture that worshipped Europe, its art, its science, its philosophy. Emerson offered something different, a permission slip for originality. He told them that America's wilderness, its solitude, its very vastness, was not a curse, but a classroom. That nature itself was the first and truest teacher. The first in time and the first in importance of the influences upon the mind is that of nature, he declared. Every day, the sun, the wind in the woods, the sound of the sea, these are our teachers. He asked them to read not only books, but the seasons, not only history, but their own hearts. Because the mind, he said, must be both mirror and lamp, reflecting truth and illuminating it anew. There was poetry in his logic, and logic in his poetry. Even those who disagreed could not look away. Some professors whispered that the man was dangerous, a seducer of minds, but others sat motionless, as if something within them had just been unlocked. And indeed, something had. For Emerson was not merely talking about scholarship, he was redefining what it meant to be American. A nation, he implied, was not built on boundaries or battles, but on imagination, on the courage to see the world for oneself. And if America were to have a destiny, it would not come from kings or capital, but from thinkers brave enough to trust their own perception. The one thing in the world of value is the active soul, he said, his voice steady. This every man is entitled to. This every man contains within him, though he may not discern it. He paused then, looking out across the hall. Some eyes glistened. Some narrowed. but none looked away. It was as though the very air had turned electric, invisible currents of recognition running through every chest. Then, with a faint smile, he ended with words that would outlive the moment. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds. The study of letters shall no longer be a matter of tradition, but of intuition. Thus, we shall deserve the name of Americans. Silence. Not applause. Not yet. Just a long, trembling quiet, as if the idea itself needed time to breathe. When it finally broke, the applause was hesitant, scattered at first, then rising like a wave. But among the older faculty there was outrage. How dare this man call Harvard scholars mere bookworms? How dare he suggest that self-trust could replace centuries of theology and canon? To Emerson, the reaction was expected, almost inevitable. He had learned long ago that truth must offend before it enlightens. Outside the hall, he walked alone through the campus, past elms whispering in the late summer breeze. The day was warm, but the wind was cool, and the sunlight flickered through the leaves like thought itself. He felt no triumph, only relief. He had said what needed to be said. Whether they would hear it was no longer his concern. In his journal that night, he wrote, "The soul knows no backward step. It builds, it transforms, it ascends." That was Emerson's America. Not a land of conquest, but of consciousness. A place where every mind was its own frontier. In the weeks that followed, newspapers printed his speech in full. Young thinkers called it revelation. Old theologians called it blasphemy. But something irreversible had begun. Students who heard him that day would go on to shape literature, politics, education, even the nation's moral compass. They carried his voice into classrooms and courtrooms, into poems and protests. And for the first time, America began to believe that its ideas could be as original as its land. The philosopher had become a patriot, though he never waved a flag. He believed the Republic's truest freedom would come not from its armies, but from its thinkers. "Men such as these," he wrote later, "will make the ages to come as grand as our forefathers made the past." In that 1 hour at Harvard, Emerson had drawn a line through history. Before him, America had imitated. After him, it began. Slowly, uncertainly, magnificently, to imagine. That night, back in Concord, he sat by his window as the crickets sang in the dark. The stars hung low, reflected faintly in the river. He wondered whether his countrymen would ever truly understand what he meant. That self-reliance was not selfishness, but reverence for the truth within. That freedom was not noise, but clarity. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness, he smiled. Somewhere, far from Harvard's solemn walls, a boy would read his words and begin to think differently. And that, he knew, was enough. Night in Concord, the world outside has gone still. Only the wind moves, slow and deliberate, whispering through the pines as though it carries an ancient secret. Inside his study, Ralph Waldo Emerson sits by the dim glow of a single candle. His pen hovers above the page, but for once he does not write. He listens. For years, he has spoken of self-reliance, of trusting one's own intuition, of walking upright through the storm of conformity. But tonight, his thoughts drift beyond the self, beyond man, beyond the fragile borders of consciousness, towards something vaster, something that feels both within and beyond him. He will later call it the Oversoul. It is not a doctrine. It is not even a belief. It is a recognition, a sudden, wordless realization that everything alive is made of the same invisible breath. In that moment, Emerson does not feel like a man thinking about God. He feels like God thinking through a man. He begins to write. his word flowing like meditation. Within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. He pauses, as if listening again. The candle flickers. It is not poetry, it is revelation. For Emerson, this is not mysticism borrowed from the East, though he has read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita with reverence. It is an American mysticism, born from solitude, from forests, from the boundless horizon that still stretches westward, untamed. The Oversoul is not above us, he writes. It is through us. It is not the property of saints or scholars. It breathes equally in the farmer, the poet, the beggar, the child. It is the silent current connecting every consciousness, the invisible music that underlies all existence. We live in succession, in division, in parts, he writes. But within man is the soul of the whole. The insight is simple, and yet terrifying, because if it is true, then no man is separate, and no act is isolated. To harm another is to wound the self. To lie is to shatter the mirror in which the divine sees its own reflection. Emerson realizes that the ultimate freedom he once sought, the independence of the self, finds its fulfillment not in isolation, but in unity. Self-reliance leads not to solitude, but to communion. He stands and walks to the window. The sky above Concord glows faintly with starlight, and the trees sway as if nodding to some cosmic rhythm. The air is thick with the scent of earth and possibility. He whispers, almost involuntarily, "There's no bar or wall in the soul where man, the effect ceases, and God, the cause, begins." He feels the boundary between himself and the night dissolve. The air enters him. The stars seem to breathe with him. He is no longer a man observing the world. He is the world observing itself. In the years that follow, Emerson will lecture on this idea across America. Audiences will listen in awe and confusion. They will nod at his words, but leave wondering whether they have understood anything at all. For the Oversoul cannot be taught. It can only be felt. He tells them that revelation did not end with the Bible. It happens every day, in every moment of genuine perception. He tells them that the universe is not dead matter, but living spirit. That every rock, every leaf, every atom hums with intelligence. He tells them that prayer is not words, but wonder. Many find comfort in his vision. Others find it unbearable. If God is within, then the church loses its monopoly. If truth is personal, then no authority is final. For the institutions of his age, religion, academia, politics, such an idea is dynamite. Yet Emerson remains serene. He knows that what terrifies the world today becomes its faith tomorrow. And so he speaks softly, gently, as if to reassure his listeners that awakening need not destroy, it can also heal. He writes, "The soul gives itself, alone, original, and pure, to the lonely, original, and pure." Those who heard him say it described a peculiar calm that filled the room, as though, for a few minutes, they had seen themselves from outside time. Men who had come as skeptics left as seekers. Women who had come weary left luminous. It was not persuasion that moved them, but presence. He had become what the ancients called a seer, not a prophet of the future, but one who sees the invisible now. The Oversoul was not merely a metaphysical concept, it was Emerson's answer to grief, to loss, to the ceaseless ache of separation. When his young wife Ellen had died years before, he had stared into the emptiness she left behind and asked, "Where is she now?" The church told him she was in heaven. His heart told him she had never left. "The soul," he wrote, "passes into all things by a sort of divine influx." She was in the light through the window, in the air he breathed, in the thoughts that visited him at dusk. Death, he came to believe, was not a departure, but a change of address within the eternal. This conviction freed him, not from sorrow, but from despair. It taught him that nothing real is ever lost, that every love, every thought, every act of kindness becomes part of the invisible network that binds the world together. In one of his later lectures, he said, "The soul in man is not an organ, but animates and exercises all the organs, is not a function like the power of memory, of calculation, of comparison, but uses these as hands and feet." To him, the Oversoul was the electricity of the divine, the force that moves through every human circuit. "We think we act alone," he said, "but in truth, we are conductors of a single energy." In his old age, visitors would often find him sitting silently by his window, eyes half closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. They would ask, "Mr. Emerson, what occupies your thoughts these days?" He would smile faintly and say, "Only that which never leaves." He no longer sought to explain, he only wanted to experience. The philosopher who once challenged conformity had now found peace, not in rebellion, but in reverence. He had built a bridge from reason to spirit, from individuality to infinity. And across that bridge, the American soul would travel, from Thoreau to Whitman to the dreamers of every age who believed that the divine could be found in a blade of grass, in a whisper of wind, in the quiet pulse of one's own heart. Late one evening, as thunder rolled softly over the hills, Emerson opened his journal and wrote his last lines on the subject. "When I am alone, I am not alone. The stars are my companions. The wind is my brother. The soul of all things moves through me, and I, too, move through them. For there is no within and without, only the great circle of being." He closed the book, blew out the candle, and for a moment, everything, the room, the air, the self, was perfectly still. In that stillness, he heard again the same silence that had haunted him since youth. The silence that was not emptiness, but the breathing of the universe itself. There are words that arrive not as thoughts, but as thunder, sentences so alive that they seem to break the air itself. For Emerson, those words came in the spring of 1841, when he sat down and wrote his most defiant work, Self-Reliance. He did not write it as a sermon or an essay. He wrote it as a confession, a declaration of spiritual independence. "Trust thyself," he began. "Every heart vibrates to that iron string." At first glance, it sounds simple, but behind those three words, "trust thyself," lies the entire weight of human loneliness, fear, and faith. It is easy to obey. It is harder to believe one's own soul. The America of Emerson's day was noisy with imitation. Politicians quoted scripture to justify ambition. Preachers repeated sermons written in London. Writers looked to Europe for permission to speak. Everywhere he looked, Emerson saw minds borrowing their courage from others. He believed that true genius was not the privilege of a few, but the birthright of everyone who dared to think without fear. To be self-reliant was not arrogance. It was obedience to the divine whisper inside. And yet, he warned, such obedience would make you lonely. "The virtue in most request is conformity," he wrote. "Self-reliance is its aversion. To trust yourself," he said, "is to enter exile from fashion, from religion, from approval. The crowd will call you arrogant. The church will call you heretic. Society will call you mad." But that, to Emerson, was the price of integrity. "Nothing," he wrote, "is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind." The essay spread like wildfire among the young and the restless. It reached those who had felt the silent ache of living by other people's expectations. It reached women who had never been told that their intuition mattered. It reached soldiers, dreamers, poets. And it burned in their chests like a slow revolution. Self-reliance was not merely philosophy, it was a dare. He told them to abandon consistency, to embrace contradiction, to live like nature, spontaneous, unpredictable, true to the season of the soul. A foolish consistency, he wrote, is the hobgoblin of little minds. In that one line, he liberated thousands who had lived chained to their own reputations. To Emerson, the self was not a fixed identity, but a current, alive, evolving, divine. And to live truthfully meant allowing that current to change course when it must. He often told the story of walking through the woods near Concord, hearing his own heart echo in the wind. There, among the trees, he found the courage that civilization had tried to take from him. Nature, he said, is never ashamed of itself. The rose does not apologize for blooming differently than the one beside it. Why, then, should man apologize for being original? To Emerson, the forest was not a place to escape to. It was a mirror, one that reflected the soul in its purest form. In solitude, he found communion, and he urged others to do the same. What I must do, he said, is all that concerns me, not what the people think. He knew the price of such freedom: isolation, misunderstanding, the cold silence of standing alone. But he believed that beyond that silence lay a peace, deeper than belonging, a belonging to the universe itself. When he lectured on self-reliance, audiences sometimes left uneasy. His calm voice carried the quiet violence of awakening. He was not telling them to rebel against government or church. He was telling them to rebel against themselves, against the part of them that feared being free. He told them that imitation is suicide, that envy is ignorance, that conformity is the slow death of the soul. Each man, he said, must build his own world with the materials of his own perception. And then he gave them an image: a ship in the harbor, its sails trembling in the wind. The crowd on shore shouts directions: "Turn here! Watch that reef!" But the captain must listen not to the crowd, but to the compass within. That compass, Emerson said, is your soul. Ignore it, and you will live safely, but never fully. Many misunderstood him. Critics called him egocentric, even dangerous. They said his philosophy would breed chaos, selfishness, arrogance. But Emerson was not teaching vanity. He was teaching sacred individuality, the idea that every person carries a divine responsibility to think for themselves. To believe your own thought, he wrote, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men. That is genius. It was not pride. It was faith in the infinite harmony of the soul. He warned that society is always conspiring against this harmony, that every institution, no matter how noble, eventually becomes a machine for conformity. To stay awake, he said, one must live as if perpetually reborn. To be self-reliant is to be perpetually beginning. And that, perhaps, was Emerson's deepest paradox. The man who believed in unity also believed in rebellion. The philosopher of harmony also preached the necessity of disruption. In private, he wrestled with his own contradictions. He was, by temperament, gentle, the opposite of the fiery independence he preached. He doubted himself. He longed for companionship even as he celebrated solitude, but he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. When a friend once asked him how he endured public criticism, Emerson smiled and said, "The great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." Sweetness, that was his secret. Not defiance for its own sake, but serenity within defiance. The quiet assurance that truth, once heard, no longer depends on applause. In time, Self-Reliance became more than a book. It became a mirror, held up to the American spirit, one that still speaks to every restless heart, standing at the edge of conformity. Its rhythm is timeless: the whisper to think, the fear to speak, the courage to stand. For Emerson, that courage was not heroism, but hygiene, the daily cleansing of the mind from fear. He wanted every man and woman to live like nature itself, open, wild, and self-renewing. He wrote, "Insist on yourself, never imitate. Every great man is unique." And then, as if summarizing his entire philosophy in one breath, to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. In his final years, when his memory began to fade, Emerson would sometimes forget his own words. He would pause in the middle of a lecture, smile faintly, and ask, "Where was I?" The audience, in reverent silence, would wait. Then after a moment he would say softly, "Ah yes, trust thyself," and every heart in the room would tremble, as if touched by that iron string once more. They said America was free. But in the quiet parlors of Boston, in the narrow pews of its churches, and beneath the orderly rhythm of its factories, that freedom was already beginning to fade, dulled by imitation, smothered by comfort. It was the 1830s, and the young nation, born from rebellion, was learning how easily rebellion turns into obedience. In those years, silence had a sound. It was the murmur of conformity, polite conversation over tea, sermons that promised heaven yet feared new thought, and the unspoken rule that one must never disturb the peace. In such a world, independence of mind, the kind that burns quietly like a candle in wind, was considered almost indecent. And yet, somewhere in that silence, one man began to listen. Ralph Waldo Emerson was not born to be a revolutionary. He wore no armor, carried no sword. He was a minister's son from Boston, soft-spoken, restrained, haunted by a gentleness that society mistook for obedience. But within him lived an unease, a hunger for something purer, freer, more alive than the clockwork religion and stale intellect around him. In his youth, he walked the same paths as every dutiful New England son. He studied theology at Harvard. He wrote sermons that soothed the congregation. He married a delicate young woman, as expected. He did everything right. But sometimes at dawn, he would walk alone along the Charles River, the mist thick as breath on glass, and feel the strange pull of something unnamed, as though nature itself was whispering that the soul was meant to be more than obedient. He did not yet have the words for it, only a discomfort, the way one feels trapped inside a suit that no longer fits, even though it was tailored perfectly. Inside the marble walls of Boston's churches, Emerson felt his spirit shrinking. He preached about divine order, but dreamt of wild forests. He spoke of duty, but longed for the sky. His sermons, though eloquent, began to tremble with questions he could no longer hide. Then death came, quietly, mercilessly, to remind him that obedience never saves us. His young wife, Ellen, whom he adored with the kind of love that made the air itself seem sacred, died of tuberculosis after less than 2 years of marriage. Emerson sat by her grave every evening, as the cemetery filled with the scent of wet leaves, and wondered how a universe that claimed to be ruled by love could be so indifferent. He opened her coffin one night, weeks after the burial, just to see if her body was truly gone. He wrote in his journal, "I visited Ellen's tomb. Why did I wish to see her again? Has she any new truth to tell me?" It was the act of a man not in madness, but in awakening, one who had glimpsed how fragile every system of belief becomes when it collides with grief. That night marked the death of his faith and inherited truth. He resigned from his pulpit soon after, declaring he could no longer serve a church that worshiped tradition more than truth. It was a quiet rebellion, no fire, no spectacle, only a letter of resignation and a deep silence that followed. But that silence was not emptiness. It was the birth of a voice. Boston called it arrogance. Harvard called it heresy. But Emerson had stepped into the wilderness, both literal and spiritual. He began walking for hours through the woods near Concord, where pine trees replaced steeples and the rustle of leaves became scripture. He felt, for the first time, that the divine was not locked in a church, but alive in every trembling branch, in every gust of wind, in the living pulse of nature. This was not religion as he had known it. It was a revelation without a priest, a conversation without an audience. He wrote, "The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." It was blasphemy to many, but to Emerson it was liberation. The moment the walls of the soul cracked open and let the infinite pour in. He began writing essays instead of sermons, replacing sacred texts with the sacredness of experience itself. And yet, for all his eloquence, Emerson was not simply rejecting tradition. He was attempting to free it. He believed that the divine voice still spoke, but that humanity had grown deaf from repetition. Religion had become a cage built for memory. Society had mistaken imitation for virtue. He saw America itself falling into that same trap. A land once founded on rebellion, now smothered by imitation of Europe. Its artists wrote like the British. Its thinkers quoted the Germans. Its politicians borrowed the language of old monarchies. Freedom had become an echo rather than a creation. So Emerson set himself a different task, not to reform institutions, but to awaken individuals. He would teach that the truest revolution begins not in the streets, but in the self. The soul, he believed, was the last frontier left unexplored. And in that frontier lay the future of civilization. But such ideas were dangerous in a country still young enough to be insecure. The more Emerson spoke, the more he became a stranger in his own society. The ministers who once invited him to dinner now crossed the street to avoid him. His friends smiled politely, but whispered that he had lost his faith. And yet, he remained calm, almost serene, as though he knew that solitude was the price of authenticity. One winter evening, he wrote in his study as snow fell softly outside his Concord home. The fireplace crackled, his ink froze between sentences, and he paused to stare at the dim lantern light flickering against the glass. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when a man finally understands that being misunderstood is not a tragedy, but a kind of freedom. Whoso would be a man, he would later write, must be a nonconformist. And with that, Emerson, the quiet minister who once feared doubt, became something else entirely. The voice of America's inner rebellion. A poet of independence, not of nations, but of souls. At dawn, the mist rolls off Walden Pond like a breath exhaled by the earth itself. The water is still, a perfect mirror. A single leaf drifts across the surface, creating ripples that travel outward until they fade into silence. Emerson stands at the edge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the reflection of the sky dissolve into the reflection of himself. This, he thinks, is what truth looks like. Not a doctrine, not a rule, but a rhythm. The universe breathing through the soul. Nature, he once wrote, always wears the colors of the spirit. He believed that nature was not merely a backdrop to human life, but the living expression of consciousness itself. A vast mirror in which the cosmos recognizes its own face. To him, the trees, the clouds, the stones, even the invisible wind were not objects but correspondences, parts of a single, self-aware whole. He had long since abandoned the notion that God existed somewhere beyond. For Emerson, divinity was not above, it was within and through. The divine was the process, the motion, the unfolding of being, the pulse that moved through stars and sap, thought and thunder. He wrote, "The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." In that one sentence, he compressed a revolution. It meant that to know the world was to know oneself, and that to betray one's own perception was to betray reality itself. To the church, it was blasphemy. To Emerson, it was revelation. He believed that perception was participation, that the act of seeing was a sacred exchange between soul and universe. When the mind looks at nature, he said, it is not observing something foreign. It is recognizing itself in another form. The I, he wrote, is the best of artists. Standing before the landscape, the poet and the philosopher were not separate beings. They were extensions of the same awareness, perceiving itself from two angles. A bird calling at dusk, a ray of light crossing the floor, a wave breaking on the shore. Each was a message in the language of being. He called this communion transparency of the I, a state in which the boundaries of the self dissolve, and man becomes a conduit of cosmic sight. I become a transparent eyeball, he wrote. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. It was the most radical line of his life, and the purest. In that transparency, he did not lose himself. He found something infinitely larger. When he walked through the woods of Concord, he did not see trees. He saw thoughts made visible. He saw in every branch an idea, in every stream an emotion. Nature was not the opposite of man. It was his reflection at a higher scale. The hills, the clouds, the stars, all part of the same unfolding consciousness that, for a brief time, took the shape of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He smiled at the thought. Even his own name was temporary, a ripple in the water. He once told Thoreau, "The sky is the daily bread of the eyes." And Thoreau, younger and fiercer, had nodded silently. They both understood that to contemplate nature was not to escape the world, but to encounter the sacred face of reality. Solitude was not withdrawal. It was conversation. Emerson's Nature, 1836, had opened with a simple invitation. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. He urged his readers to turn away from secondhand revelation, to see the divine not in ancient texts, but in the living world. He wanted a religion of immediacy, not memory. The stars, he said, awaken a sense of awe precisely because they are inaccessible, because they remind us that there are realities beyond our grasp, yet somehow inside our understanding. He called that recognition the perpetual presence of the sublime. In the 19th century, an age obsessed with machines, factories, and progress, his insistence that nature was alive, intelligent, and sacred sounded almost scandalous. And yet, he foresaw something modern. Science would one day echo that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but its foundation. That reality, at its deepest level, is awareness. He was, in a sense, the first American cosmologist of the soul. There's a passage in his journals where he describes a thunderstorm sweeping over Concord. He stands at the window, watching the lightning fracture the horizon. Instead of fear, he feels exhilaration. The same electricity that flashes above, he writes, beats within my heart. That was his cosmology, a seamless continuum between the inner and the outer, between neuron and nebula. The mind was not an island in the universe. It was the universe looking inward. To Emerson, a single human consciousness contained all of creation. To understand the self was to understand the stars. Each thought, he said, is a miniature cosmos. Each heartbeat, a planetary rhythm. He compared the mind to a mirror polished by solitude. Only when stilled can it reflect the infinite. He saw, in nature's order, a divine law, a balance that mirrored moral truth. The tides of the sea reflected the tides of conscience. Every cause had its effect. Every storm cleared the air it disturbed. Every sweet hath its sour, he wrote, every evil its good. For him, even decay was divine, for it meant that life was endlessly reforming itself. Death was not destruction, but transformation, a recycling of form in the eternal economy of being. In the forest, he saw resurrection enacted daily. But perhaps the most cinematic image of his vision came one summer night. Emerson lay in the grass, the stars glimmering above him like thoughts drifting through a divine mind. He closed his eyes and for an instant felt the vastness fold inward, the stars above and the neurons within merging into one infinite pattern. He realized that the cosmos was not something out there. It was here, pulsing through every atom, every dream. The night sky was not a window, it was a mirror. He whispered almost as if to himself, "The universe is the externalization of the soul." And in that whisper, philosophy became prayer. In his later lectures, he would speak less of rebellion and more of reverence. He had once fought the tyranny of conformity, but now he saw that the truest freedom lay in surrender. Not submission to authority, but to the harmony that underlies all things. He urged his listeners to stand in the open air and feel what the day is saying. He told them that every morning was a new creation, every sunset, a scripture. He told them that to walk through the woods without wonder was to walk in a dead world. He wrote, "The happiest man is he who learns from nature the lesson of worship." For him, worship was not ceremony, it was attention. The act of seeing, truly seeing, was itself a form of praise. By the 1850s, Emerson's Concord had become a kind of spiritual laboratory. Visitors from across the country came to breathe its air, hoping to glimpse what he had seen. Some found peace, others found confusion. He would smile and say, "It is not mine to give, it is yours to notice." He understood that awakening could not be taught. It must dawn like morning. Slowly, silently, inevitably. One evening, a young student asked him, "Mr. Emerson, do you believe the universe cares for us?" Emerson paused, smiled, and said, "The universe is us, caring for itself." The student did not understand, but years later, he would remember that line every time he looked at the stars. When Emerson died, they found his study filled with dried leaves, feathers, and stones, small relics of the natural world he'd collected for decades. Each one, it seemed, had been a teacher. Each one had reflected some secret of his own soul. On his grave in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, they placed a great rough boulder of New England granite, polished, untouched, a piece of the earth itself. Above it, carved in simple letters, was one word: Emerson. No epitaph, no dates, just the name, as if to say that even now he remained part of the landscape, the mind of nature made stone. And when the wind moves through the pines above his resting place, it sounds less like mourning and more like whispering, the sound of the cosmos remembering itself. Evening fell softly on Concord. The years had slowed their rhythm, and the house on the hill no longer echoed with the laughter of friends or the footsteps of students. Outside, the same birch trees Emerson once admired still swayed gently in the New England wind. Inside, the great mind that had mapped the heavens of thought was quietly dimming, not extinguished, but flickering like a lantern running low on oil. He would sometimes sit by the window for hours, eyes fixed on the same horizon that once inspired his words. The world he had described so vividly, full of divine correspondence and transparent meaning, now drifted in and out of focus. Names eluded him. Dates, places, faces, all dissolved like ink in water. But strangely, the loss did not torment him. It seemed to soften him instead. He was not fighting forgetfulness. He was drifting into it, as if memory itself were just another layer of illusion, one more veil between the soul and eternity. "The years teach much, which the days never knew," he once wrote. And now, those years had become his teachers. The first signs had appeared quietly. He would forget the titles of his own essays, repeat anecdotes he had told the same audience a week before. Then one day, standing in his study surrounded by his own books, he said to a friend with a faint smile, "I can no longer read what I have written." His mind, once a cathedral of thought, was slowly emptying itself, one room at a time. But in that emptiness, something luminous remained. Those who visited him during these later years often described an aura of peace around him, a gentleness deeper than intellect, a calm beyond understanding. He no longer debated or lectured. He simply listened, to the wind, to the birds, to the sound of his own breath. The philosopher had become the student of silence. His daughter Ellen, who cared for him until the end, recalled that he would sometimes pause mid-sentence and whisper, "I have lost my mental faculties, but not my faith." He no longer remembered his own words, but he remembered the feeling from which they came. The seed of all his teachings, that the soul is infinite, that truth is inward, that every man is divine, had taken root so deeply that it no longer required memory. It simply was. There is a story told by one of his neighbors. On a spring afternoon, Emerson was walking down Lexington Road when he stopped before a blooming magnolia tree. He looked at it for a long time, as though seeing it for the first time. And perhaps in a way he was. Then he turned to his companion and said softly, "It is beautiful, is it not? I do not remember its name, but I love it all the same." The man who once spoke of nature as the garment of God had forgotten the names of its threads, but not the fabric itself. The tree no longer needed to be named. It simply existed, and that was enough. The fading of memory, for most, is tragedy. But for Emerson, it was revelation. The self that once clung to knowledge was dissolving, and in its place remained something wordless and pure. He had spent a lifetime teaching that identity is illusion, that the soul is not confined by personality, memory, or mind. Now, as those things slipped away, he was living his philosophy in its most literal form. It was as though the universe were gently taking back its borrowed light. The lantern flickered, but the dawn it foretold was eternal. He wrote less and less, but when he did, his sentences became like prayers, short, luminous, stripped of ornament. "The soul knows no persons," he wrote in one of his last notes. "It asks not for names." He was no longer Ralph Waldo Emerson, the philosopher, the lecturer, the reformer. He was simply a soul, transparent, patient, waiting. At times, his lapses would take on a strange poetry. Once, at a public gathering, he was asked to speak. He rose slowly, his figure still tall, his presence still magnetic. The crowd fell silent. He began to speak of the universe, of nature, of the mystery of life. And halfway through, he stopped. He looked around as if awakening from a dream, smiled, and said, "Gentlemen, I have lost the thread." Then he bowed slightly and sat down. The audience, moved to tears, rose in applause. They understood. The thread he had lost was the one that tied words to the world. And perhaps in losing it, he had found the truth he'd sought all his life. Ellen once wrote in her diary, "Father forgets names, forgets people, forgets even me sometimes. But when he looks at the sky, he seems to know everything again." Indeed, it was as if the vast intelligence of nature, the same one he had praised in nature, had reclaimed its expression. What his mind forgot, his spirit remembered. The curve of a horizon, the whisper of pine leaves, the rhythm of a sparrow's wings. These were his scriptures now. Every sunset was a sermon, every shadow a verse, and the silence between them, the final wisdom. Visitors described his face as illuminated, even childlike. Gone were the sharpness of debate and the fire of intellect. In their place was wonder, the kind a child feels looking at snow for the first time. He seemed, in those years, to have returned to the beginning of his own philosophy, the world not as a system to explain, but as a miracle to experience. Sometimes, sitting by the fire, he would recite fragments of his own writing without realizing it. "Trust thyself," he murmured once, eyes distant. "Nothing can bring you peace but yourself." He had forgotten their authorship. The words had become unowned. Free again, part of the air. And in that unknowing, he seemed finally at peace. In April of 1882, the great thaw came late to Concord. Snow still clung to the trees, though the rivers had begun to stir. Emerson caught a chill that turned quickly to pneumonia. For several days, he lay in his bed, drifting between waking and sleep. When he opened his eyes, he often smiled, as if recognizing someone unseen. Perhaps he did. On April 27th, with his family gathered around him, he whispered a single word: "Daybreak." Then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. The news spread quietly across the country. To many, he was not just a writer, but the moral compass of America. The man who had taught a young nation how to think, how to feel, how to stand alone. At his funeral, the church overflowed with poets, philosophers, farmers, and former students. Thoreau was long gone by then, but his spirit seemed to hover there, among the trees outside. As the coffin was carried through Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, the wind moved through the pines in soft waves. The ground was damp with the first breath of spring, and on his granite tomb, a single rough stone untouched by chisel, sunlight broke through the clouds and rested for a long, still moment, a beam of light on stone. It was as if the universe itself bowed in gratitude. And so, the man who had taught millions to trust themselves died having forgotten who he was. Yet, perhaps for the first time, truly remembered what he was. Not the name, not the legacy, not the voice, but the light behind them all. In that final fading, Emerson had become what he'd always sought: a transparent soul, a mirror of the eternal, a consciousness so wide that forgetting was simply remembering too much. "The light does not go out," he once said. "It only changes rooms." And somewhere, in the vast cathedral of existence, that light still burns. Quietly, endlessly, like morning waiting to begin. The years after Emerson's death rolled forward like an echo across a canyon. Slow at first, faint, and then gathering strength as each generation called his words back into the air. His books, once scattered in parlors and libraries, began to reappear in the hands of restless minds. They were read not as philosophy, but as scripture. A gospel of individuality, a reminder that freedom begins not with governments, but with the soul. Emerson was gone, but his voice had entered the bloodstream of America. It hummed beneath its politics, its poetry, its dreams. He had not built a school or founded a movement, yet he had built something more enduring, a way of seeing. "Do not go where the path may lead," he had written. "Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." And the trails began to appear. I, Thoreau, the rebel apprentice. In the summer of 1845, a young man named Henry David Thoreau, Emerson's quiet, intense protege, left Concord Village carrying an axe on his shoulder. He walked 2 miles into the woods to the edge of Walden Pond and began to build a cabin on Emerson's land. He wanted to test his mentor's ideas, to see whether self-reliance was truly possible or just poetic talk. 2 years later, he would emerge with a book titled Walden, or Life in the Woods, a meditation on solitude, simplicity, and the sacredness of being alive. Thoreau wrote of chopping wood and counting raindrops, of watching ants wage wars in the dirt, but underneath it all beat the same Emersonian rhythm, that the individual in his solitude, contains the universe. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, Thoreau wrote, to front only the essential facts of life. It was Emerson's philosophy, lived to the letter. If Emerson had dreamed of freedom, Thoreau built it with his hands. When Thoreau later refused to pay his poll tax to protest slavery and the Mexican War, he was arrested, and out of that single night in jail came his essay, Civil Disobedience, which would echo through the centuries to come. It was Emerson's doctrine of moral independence sharpened into action. The only obligation which I have a right to assume, Thoreau wrote, is to do at any time what I think right. The ripple began. 2. Whitman, the voice of the nation. In New York, a printer's apprentice turned poet named Walt Whitman had read Emerson's essay, The Poet, and felt as if the world had opened. He called it the most important prose ever written by an American. Where Emerson had predicted a new poet who would speak for the age of democracy, Whitman believed he was that voice. In 1855, he published Leaves of Grass, a wild, ecstatic hymn to the human body, the soul, and the boundless diversity of America. It had no rhyme, no meter, no decorum, only pulse. I celebrate myself, he wrote, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. When Emerson read it, he recognized the fulfillment of his prophecy. He wrote to Whitman, I greet you at the beginning of a great career. Whitman printed those words on the spine of his next edition, a public blessing from the quiet prophet of Concord to the bohemian bard of Brooklyn. If Emerson had sown the seed, Whitman made it sing. He gave voice to the invisible, to workers, lovers, wanderers, soldiers, to the entire democratic experiment that was America. His voice, vast and tender, was the chorus to Emerson's melody, that the divine lives not above, but within. 3. The Long March of Conscience. A century later, Emerson's gospel of self-reliance would be reborn in a new context, not in the woods, but in the streets. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. Her act of stillness would ignite a movement. And among the voices rising from that struggle was a preacher from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr., who carried Emerson's spirit in his cadence. King had studied Transcendentalism at Boston University. He quoted Emerson in his sermons and echoed his defiance. A man is what he thinks all day long. King reinterpreted it through the lens of justice, that the strength of conscience could outlast the violence of oppression. In his letter from Birmingham jail, King wrote words that could have been carved from Emerson's granite prose. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. That letter, written in a narrow cell, was civil disobedience reborn, a voice echoing across 100 years. Through Thoreau to Gandhi, from Gandhi to King, the thread of Emerson's vision wound its way through the moral revolutions of the modern world. A single essay in a quiet Massachusetts study had, by slow miracle, helped shape the ethics of nations. Verdict, the American mind. Today, when Americans speak of individualism, of the right to think, to dissent, to dream, they are speaking knowingly or not, the language Emerson taught. His influence became invisible precisely because it succeeded. It seeped into the culture like air, unseen, indispensable. From Walt Whitman to Emily Dickinson, from Robert Frost to T.S. Eliot, from the pragmatists like William James to the rebels like Jack Kerouac, his fingerprints lie everywhere. Every voice that dared to speak for itself, every thinker who trusted intuition over conformity, every artist who believed creation to be an act of divinity, was echoing Emerson. Even the contradictions of America, its idealism and its excess, its loneliness and its liberty, bear his reflection. He was, as one critic said, the conscience of a restless continent. Wo, swerbadu silence, after the song. And yet, for all his influence, Emerson's later readers often forget the stillness at his core. They remember the slogans. Trust thyself, self-reliance, the Oversoul. But they forget the gentleness that held them. He did not preach arrogance, but authenticity. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but obedience to one's higher nature. His freedom was not the freedom to do as one pleased, but to become what one truly is. When the world grew loud with commerce and machines, he whispered of silence. When nations shouted of progress, he spoke of presence. When ideologies claimed to possess the truth, he reminded us that truth is not possessed, it is perceived. The soul becomes, he said, for that is the nature of the soul. That single verb, becomes, was the essence of America as he imagined it. Not a finished nation, but an unfolding consciousness. The eternal concord. Today, Concord remains quiet. Tourists wander the old path between the pond and the cemetery, where the great boulder marked Emerson still sits under the shade of pines. The wind moves through the grass, and if one listens closely, it almost sounds like language, like thought made gentle again. Somewhere nearby lies Thoreau. A little farther, Hawthorne. Across the hill, Louisa May Alcott. A constellation of minds that once burned together, now returned to the same soil. The Transcendental circle has completed its orbit. But perhaps, in another sense, it never ended. Each generation that looks inward and asks, what does it mean to be free, is repeating their conversation, the one that began by a fire in Emerson's study, when he first spoke of the soul that unites all souls. He never built monuments, but the monument remains, a nation of minds, restless, questioning, illuminated by the same faith, that truth begins within. In that sense, Emerson is not just remembered. He is reincarnated again and again, each time a person stands alone in thought and refuses to be less than honest. The free mind he envisioned was not an American invention, it was a human inheritance. He merely named it. And as long as there are those who dare to listen to their own voice, to walk without a path, to see divinity in the ordinary, Emerson's echo will continue to move through the republic of the spirit he helped create. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself, he wrote. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. That peace, quiet and invisible, still hums beneath the noise of the age. It is the sound of thought breathing, of conscience remembering itself. And if you walk through the woods of Concord on a windless evening, you might still hear it. A whisper among the birches, gentle, defiant, eternal. Trust thyself. There are moments in history when a person ceases to be merely a name, when a life dissolves into a symbol, and a voice becomes the echo of an entire civilization's conscience. For America, that moment was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Not as a saint, nor a philosopher to memorize, but as a presence. A current of invisible electricity running beneath everything the nation would one day call its spirit. The 19th century was America's adolescence. Its muscles grew faster than its mind. It had conquered frontiers, but not itself. It built cities out of wilderness and machines out of dreams. But it had not yet learned what it meant to be free inside. And then came Emerson, a quiet minister who left the church to found something larger, a republic without borders, a faith without creeds, a revolution of consciousness. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist, he wrote. Nothing is sacred but the integrity of your own mind. That sentence, copied and reprinted for nearly 2 centuries, became a kind of American prayer, recited not in cathedrals, but in classrooms, coffee shops, and quiet rooms of doubt. It was less commandment than invitation, a call to awaken from imitation, to rise from obedience into being. The republic that exists within Emerson dreamed of a new kind of nation, not a country of land, but of spirit. He called it the Republic of the Mind. In his essays, the citizens of this republic were not divided by birth or class or color, but by one thing only: their willingness to think freely. To him, democracy was not a political structure. It was a metaphysical truth, the recognition that every soul is divine, and that therefore no man may stand above another. The highest revelation is that God is in every man. This was not religion. It was rebellion at the level of ontology, a revolution of perception. The republic he spoke of did not need armies. Its laws were moral laws, its constitution, the conscience, its flag, the transparency of thought. It had no president but principle. Its citizens were all who dared to live by the light within. As the decades passed, this invisible republic began to take shape in unexpected ways. In the poetry of Whitman, the solitude of Thoreau, the courage of abolitionists, the moral thunder of reformers, everywhere someone stood alone in truth, Emerson's republic grew stronger. It existed not in geography, but in gesture. Each act of integrity, each refusal to submit to falsehood, each whisper of authenticity added one more brick to its invisible foundation. By the 20th century, his voice had woven itself so completely into the fabric of Western thought that one could scarcely tell where Emerson ended and America began. Sekou, the spiritual infrastructure of a nation. When philosophers of Europe spoke of reason, Emerson spoke of revelation. When the French exalted liberty as a right, he spoke of it as a responsibility: to see clearly, to act honestly, to live awake. He transformed freedom from a slogan into a sacrament. It was not something granted by law, but discovered in solitude. It began, as he said, when we obey the voice we hear within. And this interior democracy, this faith that every human being contains the universe, became the hidden architecture of the American soul. It inspired reformers, writers, dreamers, even entrepreneurs, all chasing some fragment of transcendence disguised as progress. From the Transcendentalists to Silicon Valley visionaries, from suffragists to civil rights leaders, from Walt Whitman's ecstatic I to the lonely voice of a songwriter whispering into a microphone, the same current runs beneath it all: a restless belief that the self is sacred and that the world can be remade from within. Third, the global echo. But Emerson's republic did not end at America's borders. His ideas traveled quietly to London, Berlin, Tokyo, Delhi. In India, Rabindranath Tagore called him the seer of the New World. In Japan, the samurai philosopher Nishida Kitaro quoted him while shaping Zen into modern thought. In Germany, Nietzsche admired his clarity and independence, calling him the author of the most perfect sentences written in any language. Even Einstein, when asked about moral philosophy, echoed Emerson's belief that a calm and modest life brings more happiness than the pursuit of success. Like light reflected through many mirrors, Emerson's ideas refracted across continents. Each thinker received him differently, but all recognized the same pulse: a call to awaken from imitation into creation. He had, without intention, founded not just an American faith, but a human one. For the machinery of modern thought. Today, Emerson's fingerprints lie quietly across everything modern. Every time a psychologist speaks of authenticity, a poet writes of oneness, a self-help author invokes the higher self, or a meditation teacher speaks of inner peace. They are borrowing, knowingly or not, from the grammar Emerson wrote into the modern psyche. His Oversoul became the ancestor of collective consciousness. His self-reliance became the blueprint for self-actualization. His nature mysticism anticipated environmental ethics by a century. His prose foreshadowed Whitman's democracy, James's pragmatism, and Jung's individuation. He was the missing link between philosophy and psychology, between theology and poetry. A one-man bridge connecting all the scattered islands of human thought. And yet, what he built was not a system, but a symphony. Fluid, unfinished, ever expanding. He did not give answers. He gave direction. Our life, he wrote, is an apprenticeship to the truth that around every circle another can be drawn. That sentence, more than any, captures his faith. That consciousness itself is the frontier, and that the universe grows each time we dare to understand it anew. V, the light in the machine. It would be easy to imagine Emerson as outdated, a relic of a quieter, handwritten century. But in an age of algorithms and artificial minds, his relevance only deepens. He warned, even in the 1840s, of the soul's dependence on mechanism. Things are in the saddle, he wrote, and ride mankind. And now, as screens glow brighter than stars, his words return like prophecy. He would ask us not to destroy our inventions, but to spiritualize them, to remember that the mind which creates the machine is always greater than the machine itself. In a sense, the digital world is Emersonian, a vast web of connection, a reflection of the Oversoul rendered in circuitry. Yet it also threatens to undo his lesson, to make us forget that consciousness, not code, is the true miracle. His voice, if it could reach us now, would whisper the same command. Stand apart and think for yourself. Be not the echo, but the origin. The Republic of the Spirit cannot survive on automation. It must be renewed each time a single person dares to be awake. 6. Emerson as America's soul. If one were to distill the American experiment, its contradictions, its aspirations, its light and shadow, into a single idea, it would be Emerson's faith in the divinity of the individual. Not the self as consumer or ego, but as a fragment of the infinite. A spark of the divine that justifies all freedom, all dignity, all creation. To Emerson, the individual was not the enemy of the collective. He was its wellspring. When each soul listens inwardly, the harmony that emerges is democracy. His America was not a nation of laws, but of awakenings. In that sense, Emerson's true republic was never built on earth. It exists wherever thought becomes honest, where the heart resists cynicism, where a single person dares to say, "I see," before asking, "Do you agree?" That republic has no capital, but conscience. No flag, but truth. And its anthem is silence. The silence between two breaths, where understanding begins. 7. The immortal tone. So now, more than 2 centuries since his birth, Emerson's body lies still, but his vibration continues. Each time a young writer refuses imitation, each time a scientist looks at the stars and feels not coldness, but kinship. Each time an artist paints without apology, the current hums again. It is the pulse of the Oversoul, the quiet heartbeat of America's invisible religion, a faith in consciousness, in the infinite worth of a single human being. In the end, Emerson did not give America its identity. He gave it its reflection. He held up a mirror, and in it, the nation saw not perfection, but potential. He gave it not a creed, but a compass. The mind, he wrote, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions. And so, neither did America. Even now, if you walk through the old woods of Concord at dawn, you may feel it. That subtle hum in the air, the living republic of the spirit. It is not bound by language or faith or time. It exists wherever thought becomes luminous. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of his voice, steady, luminous, eternal. The soul knows the way. Trust it, and the universe will follow. Night again, overconquered. The river glimmers faintly under the pale New England moon. The house where Ralph Waldo Emerson once dreamed still stands, wooden, modest, timeless, its windows breathing light like faint memory. If you listen closely, you might still hear it. A quiet voice moving through the birch trees, the whisper of pages turning themselves. More than a century has passed since that voice last spoke aloud, and yet it has never stopped speaking. It echoes not from his grave, but from the air itself, from the way Americans talk about freedom, from the way poets describe the sky, from the way you and I, sitting in silence, still feel that faint tug inside, the one that says, "There's more." The eternal return. Emerson once wrote that the soul becomes, not is, not was, but becomes, forever unfinished, forever returning. And so too has he returned, not as a man, but as a movement of light across the human spirit. Every few decades, the world seems to rediscover him. When despair grows loud, his voice comes back. Gentle, measured, full of faith in the invisible. When materialism smothers meaning, someone opens nature again and feels the pulse beneath the words. When cynicism reigns, he reappears like sunrise through fog. He never stayed buried. He became cyclical, a philosopher who reincarnated through ideas, through every generation that dared to think freely. In that way, he fulfilled his own prophecy. There is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning. Du Dutroux, the light that teaches silence. What remains of Emerson is not doctrine, but a light. Not blinding, not loud, but patient. It asks nothing, yet illuminates everything. It does not demand faith, it invites recognition. He taught that revelation is not a thunderclap, but a candle flicker. The divine does not speak in temples, but in the spaces between thoughts. That is why his philosophy has never aged, because it was not tied to theory, but to perception. He gave humanity permission to look inward and find eternity there. He made the sacred ordinary again, and in doing so, he liberated millions of people who did not even know they were prisoners. Prisoners of imitation, of fear, of belonging. He told us we could be alone and still be whole. He told us solitude was not exile, but communion. He told us the soul, when quiet, is vast enough to contain God. The Republic beyond time. If America has a soul, it is Emerson's unfinished sentence. You can feel it in the country's contradictions, its hunger for freedom, and its fear of it, its obsession with progress, and its nostalgia for purity, its loneliness amid abundance. He is the tension in that paradox, the steady hum beneath its noise, reminding a restless nation that the real revolution was never political, but spiritual. His Republic of the Spirit lives wherever truth is pursued without permission. Each generation that dares to begin again, to reinvent art, morality, or selfhood, is still carrying his torch, even if they've forgotten his name. He did not teach us what to believe. He taught us how to believe again, in thought, in nature, in ourselves. That was his quiet rebellion. That remains his unending revolution. The universe. Within a breath. Emerson believed the world outside and the world within are mirrors. And if one looks long enough, one begins to see the same reflection in both. Tonight, as we sit here, perhaps under lamplight or in the glow of a phone, his words still ripple through that ancient mirror. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. For centuries, theologians argued about divinity. Emerson simply felt it. as wind, as wonder, as the breath of thought itself. He saw what mystics saw, what poets sang, what scientists would later prove, that everything, from atom to star, from thought to emotion, is connected by one continuous vibration. To recognize that, even for an instant, is to experience the Oversoul he spoke of. It is to stand at the edge of all things and realize there was never an edge. And so, when his memory faded, when even his own name slipped away, perhaps he was not losing himself at all. Perhaps he was returning, dissolving back into the great whole he had spent his life describing. V, a whisper for the future. Emerson belongs to the 19th century by birth, but to the 22nd, 23rd, and all centuries by spirit. His philosophy is not history, it is architecture. It builds inward. Each time a generation rediscovers mindfulness, each time a person walks into the woods seeking meaning rather than escape. Each time someone rejects imitation and speaks their truth, Emerson is there, quietly smiling. He has no need of statues. He lives where the self meets sincerity. He exists in the exact moment when a human being decides to listen to themselves. Not their feed, not their fear, but the soft compass of the inner voice. The only person you are destined to become, he said, is the person you decide to be. It is the simplest, and therefore, the hardest truth. 6. The light that never leaves. At his funeral, the minister described Emerson's spirit as a light that does not die, but changes form. It was meant as poetry. It turned out to be prophecy. Because even now, long after his body became dust, his light keeps changing form. It burns in the courage of young thinkers, in the humility of scientists, in the stillness of dreamers and the faith of doubters. It glows in classrooms where curiosity outshines conformity. It flickers in every late-night moment of self-questioning. When the noise of the world fades and something wordless whispers, "Be yourself," that whisper is Emerson. He has become the unseen element of the modern soul, the transparency behind our constant search for meaning. Not worshipped, but woven into the moral fabric of being awake. 7. The return to Concord. If you ever visit Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, you'll find his resting place beneath a simple granite boulder. There are no statues, no grand mausoleums, only stone, pine, and silence. And somehow, it feels exactly right. Every so often, someone leaves a note on his grave. A folded paper, rain-stained, with a line or two. "Thank you for helping me find myself," or simply, "I understand now." The wind carries those words away. They join the murmur of leaves, the same sound Emerson once called the voice of nature, speaking to the soul. If consciousness has an afterlife, this must be it. Not a heaven above, but a harmony within, playing forever. 8. The circle closes. In Nature, his first great essay, Emerson wrote, "Each moment, the doors of the soul open, and we are born again." Tonight, those doors are still open. We have walked with him through them, through grief and insight, rebellion and wonder. And now we stand where he once stood, at the edge of the infinite, quietly aware that we are part of it. His journey was never about Emerson becoming immortal. It was about us realizing that we already are. For the soul, as he taught, is not bound by birth or death, but only by ignorance. And when we awaken, even for a breath, we participate in eternity. The light does not go out. It only changes rooms. And if you close your eyes tonight, listening not to the noise of the world, but to the silence beneath it, you might feel it, faint and eternal. The same current that moved through Emerson, through Thoreau, Whitman, and every free spirit since, flowing now through you, Rue.